If you enjoy justice tales, revenge stories with meaning, and emotionally powerful narratives where intelligence defeats cruelty, this channel is for you. Subscribe to Justice Tales Unveiled for unforgettable stories where silence speaks, truth emerges, and justice always finds its way. The man who ruined my life was shaking, though he was trying not to show it. The room was quiet in the way hospitals are quiet at night, not peaceful, just stripped of noise. Rain tapped against the window in thin, patient strokes. A single lamp cast a yellow circle over the table between us, illuminating his hands as they rested flat on the wood, palms down, as if gravity itself might carry him away if he lifted them. He did not recognize me. That was the first mercy I denied him. "I don't understand why I'm here," he said, keeping his voice level. Years in courtrooms had taught him how to sound calm, even when he wasn't. "My assistant said you had information, something urgent." I said nothing. I had learned over time that silence does more work than speech ever could. He swallowed. The sound was small but noticeable, the kind of sound a man makes when he senses, without proof, that the ground beneath him has shifted. On the table lay a single folder, thin, ordinary, the sort of thing that passes through offices every day and leaves no memory behind. His eyes kept drifting to it, then away again, like a child pretending not to stare at a bruise. "You should open it," I said. My voice surprised him. It always did. People expect anger. They expect heat. They expect revenge to announce itself loudly, with teeth bared. Instead, my voice was flat, almost bored, as if this meeting were administrative, as if it had been scheduled years ago and we were simply late. He opened the folder. The first page was enough. His breath left him, not all at once, but in pieces. His shoulders tensed, his fingers tightened on the paper, creasing it slightly. He turned the page too quickly, then slowed, as if hoping the rest would somehow be less precise. It wasn't. Dates, names, signatures, internal memos he had once believed were buried, statements that contradicted sworn testimony. A quiet map of decisions that had ended someone else's life without ever staining his own hands. "This is impossible," he said finally. "These records were sealed." "Yes," I said. "They were." He looked up at me then. Really looked. For the first time, something close to recognition stirred behind his eyes. Not memory, but instinct. The sense that the person across from him was not an accident. "Who are you?" he asked. I let the question sit between us. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. The world continued doing what it always does, moving forward, unaware that balance was about to be corrected in one small, unremarkable room. "I'm not here for an apology," I said, "so you can stop searching for one." His mouth opened, then closed. His training betrayed him. He didn't know which version of himself to present. The righteous public servant, the confused citizen, the wounded elder statesman. "What do you want?" he asked. At last, I slid the folder back toward him, aligning it carefully with the edge of the table. "I want you to remember," I said. "Before this ends, I want you to remember everything." His hands began to tremble now. Not violently. Just enough. This was the moment people imagine when they think of revenge, the confrontation, the exposure, the reckoning. They imagine it loud, immediate, emotional. They imagine a man like me bursting into his life, demanding payment. They are always wrong. Revenge was not immediate. That's why it worked. Years earlier, injustice arrived quietly. It didn't kick down doors or announce itself with violence. It came in the form of paperwork, polite language, and the unspoken understanding that some lives are easier to erase than others. My brother, Daniel, was one of those lives. He was 32, a civil engineer, careful to the point of irritation. The kind of man who returned tools cleaner than he borrowed them, who read contracts twice, who believed that if you followed the rules long enough, they would eventually protect you. The accident report said a structural failure caused the collapse. It was written within 48 hours, neat and conclusive. The press release followed shortly after, regret expressed, condolences offered, no wrongdoing found. Case closed. I remember standing in the rain outside the courthouse the day the inquiry ended. No cameras, no protesters. Just a few family members holding umbrellas that didn't quite keep the water out. The building loomed behind us, stone and glass, indifferent. They didn't even call the witnesses we named, my mother said. Her voice was tired, not angry. Anger requires hope. The man who would one day sit across from me, the man now trembling under hospital light, had stood at a podium inside that building and spoken about integrity, about procedure, about how tragic events sometimes occur, despite everyone's best efforts. He never once said my brother's name. That was the first lesson injustice teaches you. It doesn't need cruelty to function. It only needs distance. I didn't fight then. I didn't protest or shout or demand justice in public spaces. I filled out forms. I requested documents. I was denied access politely, repeatedly. People mistook my silence for acceptance. They always do. Grief does strange things to time. Days stretch thin, then vanish entirely. Months pass like fog. Somewhere inside that blur, I learned how to survive. I left the city. There was nothing left for me there but echoes. I took a job far away, under my own name at first, then under others. I studied what had killed my brother, not the collapse itself, but the system that allowed it to be explained away. I learned how investigations are steered without appearing touched, how language can absolve without lying, how responsibility can be diluted across departments until it no longer belongs to anyone at all. Years passed. The man from the folder grew older, more respected. Awards accumulated. Panels invited him to speak about transparency. Students quoted him in essays. The world forgot. I didn't. Time sharpened memory. It stripped away emotion and left behind clarity. Rage burns itself out quickly. Patience does not. By the time I returned, I no longer needed justice to feel personal. That was important. Personal revenge is fragile. It breaks under scrutiny. What I wanted was balance. Back in the room, the man looked smaller than his reputation. Age had softened his face, but not his eyes. Those were still sharp, calculating even now. "You can't release this," he said. "There are safeguards, people who will stop you." "I know," I replied. "I built them." That landed harder than any threat. He stared at me, searching for cracks in my certainty. He would not find any. This moment had already happened dozens of times, in planning, in rehearsal, in thought. He was simply arriving late. "You think this will bring him back?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice at last. I considered the question carefully. "No," I said. "I think it will finish something that was left undone." He leaned back, exhaling slowly. Somewhere deep inside him, The realization was forming, not that he might lose everything, but that he deserved to. "You're making a mistake," he said, though it sounded more like habit than belief. I stood. "This wasn't a mistake," I said. "It was a decision. You made yours years ago." As I turned toward the door, he spoke again, softer now. "What happens next?" I paused, my hand on the handle. "Now," I said, "you wait, just like we did." Behind me, the folder lay open, its contents finally exposed to the air. Outside, the rain continued its patient work, erasing nothing, revealing everything. And somewhere beyond that door, the next part of the reckoning was already in motion. Because justice, once set in motion, does not rush, it arrives when there is nowhere left to hide. Injustice rarely announces itself. It doesn't knock. It doesn't threaten. It arrives with forms already filled and conclusions already written, wearing the neutral expression of inevitability. The first time I realized this was the day they called Daniel's death, an unfortunate convergence of factors. Those words were delivered calmly across a polished table by people who had practiced saying them. They spoke as if the phrase itself carried weight enough to settle the matter, as if naming something unfortunate absolved it of responsibility. I sat there listening, my hands folded, my questions prepared. I asked about load tolerances, about inspection timelines, about a report Daniel had submitted 3 weeks before the collapse, flagged urgent, recommending immediate suspension of work. They acknowledged it politely. Then they moved past it. The official narrative formed quickly. Structural fatigue. Human error, unspecified. No single point of failure. No individual accountable. The system had spoken, and it had decided to forget. I remember leaving that meeting with a strange sensation, not anger, not grief, but something colder. A realization settling quietly into place. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a choice. Daniel had believed in process. That was his flaw, if it could be called one. He trusted systems because he had helped build them. He assumed oversight existed because it was written into manuals. He believed that warnings mattered because they were documented. When he noticed inconsistencies in the materials used on the project, he followed procedure. When stress tests returned irregular results, he escalated. When his supervisor delayed action, he put his concerns in writing. The email still exists. It is brief, precise. Professional, no accusations, no emotion. Just facts, measurements, and a clear recommendation. Stop work until further evaluation. He sent it at 9:14 a.m. The collapse happened 12 days later. The investigation acknowledged the email, then neutralized it. They described it as one of several internal communications expressing generalized concern. They reclassified the data. They reframed urgency as caution. They buried clarity under volume. No one lied outright. They didn't have to. After the inquiry ended, I requested access to the raw inspection files. I was denied due to ongoing internal review. I appealed. I waited. Months passed. The review never concluded. I learned then that time is the most effective barrier a system has. People grieve quickly. They exhaust themselves. They move on. I did not. Instead, I left. There's a difference between retreat and repositioning. At the time, it looked like disappearance. I sold what I didn't need. I took work wherever it was offered. I changed addresses. I stopped explaining myself. Silence became a tool. I studied quietly. Not law in the abstract, but process. How investigations are shaped before they begin. how committees are formed, how oversight bodies rely on summaries rather than sources, how reputations protect decisions long after evidence suggests otherwise. I learned the language they used when they wanted something to vanish. Operational discretion, procedural limitation, insufficient causative clarity. Each phrase a door gently closing. Years passed this way. The city where Daniel died built over the site. A new structure rose, praised for its resilience. A plaque commemorated those lost without names. I stood across the street one afternoon and watched people walk past it without reading. The man responsible, the man from the room, advanced steadily. He chaired panels on ethical governance. He wrote editorials on accountability. His face became familiar, trusted. In public, he was careful. In private, he was invisible. That invisibility was earned. I didn't approach him. Not then. I didn't send letters or leak documents. Exposure too early would have ended everything. Truth, when introduced without context, is dismissed as noise. Instead, I followed paths backward. I traced approvals. I mapped signatures. I noted which objections were overridden and by whom. Patterns emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. One override stood out, a late-stage compliance waiver. Granted 2 weeks before the collapse, it allowed construction to continue pending supplementary review. The signature was his. At the time, it meant nothing. One decision among thousands. But decisions do not exist in isolation. The waiver had required justification. That justification referenced an internal risk assessment. That assessment had been compiled from inspection data Daniel had helped generate. But the figures were different, not altered exactly, adjusted, rounded, presented with margins emphasized and anomalies footnoted. Technically accurate, morally false. The system had not ignored Daniel's warning. It had absorbed it. That was the moment I understood how injustice survives scrutiny. It doesn't erase opposition. It incorporates it, reframes it, and moves forward unchanged. I needed proof that could not be reframed, so I waited. Opportunity came quietly, as it always does. A regulatory restructuring created temporary access gaps. Departments merged, archives shifted, old digital systems were migrated, their permissions reset by overworked staff following checklists. I took a contract inside one of those systems, not close enough to raise suspicion, but near enough to observe. I watched files move. I noted discrepancies. I saved nothing. Not yet. Patience is not passive. It is active restraint. The first real confirmation arrived one evening, years after Daniel's death, in the form of a mislabeled directory. Inside were drafts, early versions of reports, internal emails never meant for review. One message stopped me. It was short, written by him, sent to a subordinate. Delay escalation. We can't afford disruption at this stage. No legal language, no caution, just intent. The timestamp placed it 3 days after Daniel's email. 3 days. I sat with that knowledge for a long time. This was no longer systemic inertia. This was choice. Still, I did nothing. Evidence without structure is accusation. Accusation invites defense. Defense delays resolution. I needed inevitability. So I built it. Over the next several years, I assembled context, piece by piece. I mapped the network of decisions that converged on that one message. I identified who had benefited from the delay, who had covered quietly, who had never asked questions. Not villains, functionaries. The system had not been corrupt in the dramatic sense. It had been efficient. That made it harder to confront and easier to repeat. I positioned myself carefully. I became useful to people adjacent to power. I learned how influence flows without peering to. I gained access not through force, but through competence. By the time I returned to the city openly, no one noticed, except him. He didn't recognize me at first. Why would he? To him, Daniel had been a name in a report, long resolved. I was no one at all. That was an advantage. I watched him from a distance. His routines were predictable, his confidence intact. He believed the past was sealed because no one had challenged it. He had mistaken silence for closure. The meeting was arranged through intermediaries. I framed it as informational, time-sensitive, sensitive enough to require discretion. He agreed. That night, before we met, I reviewed everything one last time. The evidence, the chain, the outcome. There was no satisfaction in it. No anticipation, just a sense of completion approaching. When he opened the folder and began to understand, I saw something shift behind his eyes. Not fear yet, but recognition of pattern. He realized this wasn't an attack. It was an audit. After I left him alone with the truth, I did not go home. Instead, I walked. The rain had slowed to a mist. Streetlights reflected off wet pavement in long, broken lines. Somewhere nearby, a train passed underground, its vibration barely perceptible. The city felt unchanged. That was the final illusion. Because while he sat there calculating damage, something else had already begun. Not public, not visible. A process. I reached my car as my phone vibrated once in my pocket. A single message. No text. Just a confirmation code. The first release had been scheduled. Not exposure. Verification. I stood there for a moment, listening to the city breathe, knowing that by morning systems would begin asking questions they could not dismiss. And for the first time since my brother died, I allowed myself a single thought, not of revenge, not of victory, but of consequence. Because once truth enters a system quietly, it does not leave. And the man who believed he had survived the past was about to learn that some decisions do not expire. The first sign that something had changed came quietly. It was not an arrest, not a headline, not even a phone call. It was a question, a routine question, asked by a junior analyst in a department that rarely drew attention. The kind of question that usually received a short answer and was forgotten before lunch. But this time, it did not go away. The analyst noticed a mismatch between two archived summaries. One showed a risk level marked as acceptable. The earlier draft, pulled automatically during system verification, showed the same risk marked as elevated. The difference was small. A word, a classification. But systems are built on consistency. When something does not match, the system pauses. And when the system pauses, it looks backward. The man from the room felt it before he understood it. He woke that morning with a sense of pressure behind his eyes. Not fear, not yet, just discomfort. The kind that comes when something unresolved begins to move. At breakfast, he skimmed the news. Nothing. He checked his calendar, full but manageable. He reassured himself with routine. He had survived worse. By mid-morning, his assistant mentioned a request from compliance. They wanted clarification on an old approval process. Very old, mostly procedural. He answered smoothly. He always did. By afternoon, there was another request, different department, same project. That was unusual. By evening, he was tired in a way sleep would not fix. He sat alone in his study that night, reviewing notes he had not looked at in years. He told himself he was being careful, responsible, but his hand hovered too long over certain pages. Memory, once disturbed, does not return to rest easily. For me, the day passed without drama. That was important. I went to work. I answered emails. I spoke to people who had no idea what was unfolding. I drank coffee that tasted thin and bitter. I did not rush. Justice does not need witnesses at every step. Behind closed systems, verification protocols continued their slow work. One request became two. Two became a review. A review required context. Context requires documents. Documents require explanations. Each step triggered the next, not because someone wanted it to, but because that is how the system was designed. This was not exposure. This was friction. The man began to feel watched, though no one was watching him yet. He called an old colleague casually, asked if there was anything unusual happening. The colleague laughed it off, said no, said he was being paranoid. Still, the man did not sleep well. At 3 in the morning, he opened a locked drawer and removed a thin folder. Inside were copies he had kept, just in case. He read them carefully, checking margins, dates, signatures. Everything was still technically defensible. That was what he told himself. What he did not consider was this. Technical defenses only work when no one is looking too closely. And now someone was. The first meeting was scheduled without his input. A review session. Internal. No press. No accusations. Just alignment. He attended, confident but alert. The questions were polite. Why was this classification changed? Who reviewed the final wording? Why was escalation delayed? He answered each one clearly, calmly. He cited policy. He referenced authority. He explained timing. The room listened. They did not interrupt. That unsettled him more than argument would have. When the meeting ended, no conclusions were shared, no outcomes announced. "Thank you for your time," they said. That was all. People believe danger announces itself. It rarely does. Danger begins when answers stop closing doors. The next week, an independent auditor was added for completeness. The week after that, a secondary review was requested to ensure transparency. The language was careful. The pressure was not. The man began canceling engagements. He declined interviews. He delayed travel. He told himself it was temporary. His name did not appear in the news, but it began appearing in internal emails. That was worse. I watched none of this directly. I did not need to. Systems leave traces. Reactions ripple outward. Silence shifts tone. I knew the moment he contacted legal counsel that the process had reached a point of no return. Lawyers do not stop systems. They slow them. Slowing only matters when time favors you. This time it did not. One evening, months into the review, he requested another meeting with me. Personally, urgently. I considered ignoring it. Then I agreed. We met in a different room this time, smaller. No windows, neutral lighting. He looked older, thinner. His confidence had not vanished, but it had cracked. "You said you weren't here for an apology," he said. "I'm still not," I replied. "You planned this," he said. "It was not an accusation. It was a statement." "Yes." He leaned back slowly, eyes on the ceiling. "You could have exposed everything at once," he said. "Why didn't you?" "Because exposure invites defense," I said. "Verification invites acceptance." He closed his eyes briefly. "They're not accusing me," he said. "Not yet." "No," I said. They're confirming you. He laughed once, dry, humorless. You're patient, he said. I had time, I replied. He looked at me then, really looked, as if trying to measure what this had cost. What do you want at the end of this? He asked. The question surprised him, I think. He expected demands, confession, punishment. I want the truth to stand on its own, I said. Without me. He was silent for a long time. Then he asked a different question. Did he know? He said quietly. Your brother. Did he know what would happen? I answered honestly. I think he believed the system would protect him. The man nodded slowly. So did I, he said. That was the closest he came to regret. The final phase began without ceremony. The auditor's report triggered a mandatory external review. That review required sworn statements. Sworn statements required consistency. Inconsistency attracts attention. Attention demands explanation. Explanations create records. Records endure. At no point did anyone need my testimony. That was intentional. Justice is strongest when it does not depend on the injured. The man stopped calling. His lawyers spoke for him now. I received updates through channels I had built long ago and no longer needed to maintain. The system was doing what it does best when left alone, correcting itself, slowly, relentlessly. One morning, as I prepared to leave for work, my phone vibrated. This time there was text. Preliminary findings confirmed. Formal proceedings approved. I read it once. Then I deleted it. Outside, the day had begun like any other. Cars moved, people hurried. The world remained unaware that a long imbalance was finally tipping. Somewhere across the city, the man was being informed that the review was no longer internal, that it was no longer quiet, that it was no longer controllable. He would soon understand that this was not a negotiation. It was the end of waiting. And as I stepped into the street, blending once again into the ordinary flow of people, I knew the next stage would force him to face the one thing he had avoided for years. Not punishment, responsibility. The public still did not know his name. That was the strange part. Formal proceedings had begun. Files had moved outside private systems. Oversight bodies were now involved. Yet the world remained quiet. No headlines, no outrage, no public anger. Justice was moving, but it was moving inward first. For the man, that silence was worse than noise. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Not by email, not by phone. Paper, official, heavy, delivered by hand. He stared at it for a long time before opening it. The seal alone carried meaning. External review board, mandatory cooperation, failure to comply would be noted. This was no longer advice, it was instruction. Inside, the language was calm and clear. He was required to submit a sworn statement. He was required to account for decisions made during the approval process. He was required to explain delays, reclassifications, and overrides. He was given dates. He was given no room. He called his lawyers immediately. They spoke carefully. They used phrases like manageable exposure and procedural defense. They reminded him that nothing had been proven yet. But their voices were different now. They were no longer confident. They were cautious. Caution, he knew, meant risk. In the days that followed, his life began to shrink. Meetings were cancelled until further notice. Invitations stopped coming. Old colleagues avoided him, not out of cruelty, but fear. Fear spreads quietly. He noticed small changes. Security badges checked more closely. Emails copied to more people than necessary. conversations that ended when he entered the room. He had spent years building trust. Trust, once questioned, dissolves fast. For the first time, he tried to look backward honestly. He reviewed the decision again, the delay, the message he had sent, the reasoning he had accepted without questioning too deeply. At the time, it had seemed minor, a pause, a compromise. Now it looked different. Now it had weight. We did not speak again during this period. There was nothing left to say. I watched events unfold from a distance, not with satisfaction but with focus. This phase was delicate. Too much pressure could provoke defense. Too little could allow escape. But the system was past that point. Sworn statements had power. Once words are locked into record, they cannot be reshaped. His statement was submitted late. That was noted. It was also inconsistent. That was worse. Dates did not align. Language shifted between drafts. Responsibility moved subtly from one department to another. The review board noticed. They always do. A follow-up request was issued. More questions, more detail, less patience. The first leak happened 2 weeks later. Not a full story, just a mention. Former official under review for approval irregularities in past infrastructure case. No names, no accusations, but enough. Enough for journalists to begin looking. Enough for the past to become interesting again. The man saw the notice on his phone while sitting alone at his desk. He read it twice, then a third time. This was the moment he had avoided for years. Public memory. He knew what came next. Requests for comment, archived footage, old speeches, contradictions waiting to be found. Once the public begins asking questions, silence is no longer protection. It is suspicion. That evening, he stood in his study, lights off, city glowing faintly through the window. The thin folder lay open on his desk, the same one he had kept hidden for years. He no longer read it. He already knew what it contained. What he did not know, what he could not know, was how far the correction would go. Systems, once forced to admit error, do not stop at one name. They follow logic, and logic is ruthless. My phone rang late that night. Unknown number. I did not answer. A message followed. Just 6 words. They are asking about your brother. I sat down slowly. Not because I was afraid, but because this was the point of no return. Once his name entered the record again, the story would no longer belong to the man alone. It would belong to the truth. Across the city, the man received another message, this one from his lawyer. Urgent. External investigators had requested original inspection data, unedited, including emails, including internal messages, including the one he had hoped would never surface. The one sent 3 days after Daniel's warning. He closed his eyes. For the first time, there was no argument left to make. Only one question remained. How much would the system take back? The end did not arrive with noise. There were no sirens, no dramatic arrest, no shouting crowds. No moment that could be clipped into a headline and replayed. Justice arrived the way it always does when it is real. On paper. The external report was released 6 months later. It was long, careful, boring to most people. That was its strength. It listed decisions, not emotions, timelines, not opinions. It showed how warnings were received, softened, delayed, and finally ignored. It showed how responsibility moved upward, not downward. It showed how one approval made all later damage possible. Daniel's name appeared 11 times. Not as a victim, as a professional who had done his job. That mattered. The man was not described as evil. He was described as negligent, as someone who chose continuity over caution, stability over safety, procedure over life. The report did not speculate on motive. It did not need to. Intent was proven by action and by delay. His resignation came quietly. One paragraph, no explanation. A line about the importance of public trust. People reacted briefly. Some defended him, some condemned him. Most moved on. That was expected. Justice does not require agreement, only accuracy. There were consequences. His professional standing was removed, his certifications revoked, his past decisions flagged for review. Other projects he had touched were re-examined. Some held, some did not. The system corrected more than one error. That was never about him alone. I was asked once if I wanted to speak publicly. I declined. There was nothing left to add. The truth no longer needed a voice. My brother's record was amended. The final version of the investigation included a clear statement. Prior warnings were valid and should have resulted in immediate action. That sentence changed nothing about the past, but it changed the meaning of it. I visited the site one last time. The building still stood, strong, clean, busy. A new plaque had been added nearby, not large, not dramatic, just names. Daniels was there. I stood for a while. Then I left. People imagine revenge as relief. It is not. It is weight. The weight of knowing that balance has been restored, but nothing has been undone. The weight of understanding that justice costs time, silence, and parts of yourself you do not get back. I was not the same person I had been before. Neither was the world. That was the point. The man and I never spoke again. We did not need to. He lived the rest of his life smaller than before, not ruined, not destroyed, just corrected. That was enough. The world continued. Buildings rose. Systems moved forward. New decisions were made, hopefully with more care than before. Injustice had been answered. Not with anger, not with speed, but with patience and inevitability. Justice was complete. Peace, as always, was complicated, but the balance held. And for the first time in many years, I stopped waiting.